There's a lot of debate about whether journalists, like me, should say it's a genocide.
Well, I think journalists should describe what's happening, and that I think the best thing for journalists is to go and ask experts like me.
But you say it's a genocide.
Yeah.
Joining me is William Schabas, a leading expert in international law and a genocide expert. You have written over 20 books and 400 articles on genocide, the ICC, and international justice. And with a career spanning decades, you have advised the UN on the death penalty and played a key role in shaping global legal frameworks. Thank you for being here. Let's start with what actually are war crimes and what are crimes against humanity and what is a genocide from the legal perspective. Could you explain that to me?
We use the term war crimes in a very generic sense, not a technical sense, to describe all of these crimes. Sometimes people call them atrocity crimes as well, but there's this trio of legal categories: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and they've been prosecuted at the major international criminal tribunals, and we make distinctions between them. So war crimes, you have to have a war, and it generally will involve things about violations on the battlefield, between soldiers, or where soldiers are targeting civilians, and also people under the control of one of the parties, like prisoners of war, and more importantly, civilians, obviously, in an occupied territory. Crimes against humanity is used in a different context, generally to describe what a government is doing to its own people, whereas war crimes are typically and traditionally been about what you did to others. So the idea of crimes against humanity was developed, it developed at the time of the Second World War in order to cover the violations inside Germany, because the violations of fundamental rights in occupied countries, like the Netherlands, were war crimes. And what was needed was a category that would cover violations by a government against its own people. And then genocide is the final one, and it's sometimes called the crime of crimes. Genocide is really, it's best to think of it as a category of crimes against humanity, but maybe the most serious or the worst of them, because it involves not just persecution of a group under your control, but destruction.
If we talk about the current war in Gaza, how would you classify what Israel is doing there at the moment?
There's no doubt that war crimes have been committed, many war crimes, such as indiscriminate attacks or attacks directed against civilians. It's not always easy to draw a line between those two categories, but basically the only people that you're legally allowed to attack are military objectives. And so when you don't attack military objectives and civilians are killed, the question is, was it because you were indiscriminate, you didn't distinguish between the civilians and the military, or was it because you were deliberately attacking the civilians? And it looks like there's a lot of evidence that it's one of those two. The genocide charge is, of course, much more, requires more particular evidence. It really requires this evidence of the destruction. The debate always is going to be about what's the nature of the destruction? Is it physical destruction? Are you trying to drive people out of the country rather than kill them within the country? Often it's a mix of the two.
But if we do talk specifically about Gaza, could you sum up for me why it is a genocide?
I think the evidence...
According to you, yeah.
I believe that the evidence of genocide in Gaza over the past 15, 16 months since the conflict began in October of 2023 is very, very strong, compelling evidence of genocide. Of course, the underlying acts of genocide, the killing and so on, there's no problem demonstrating that takes place. The intent to destroy the group can be manifested, first of all, by the acts themselves, which look like making life in Gaza impossible by the destruction of the entire civilian infrastructure, institutions that have no obvious military purpose at all. All the universities in Gaza have been destroyed. The hospitals have been destroyed. So this, and then we have to combine that with these horrifying, appalling statements by Israeli politicians that have not stopped either.
Such as?
Such as that there are no civilians in Gaza. They're all Hamas fighters. Or that we have to, the original statement, it was Gallant, who the former Minister of Defense or War, I don't know what his official title is, the head of the military, and he said we're going to cut off food, water, medical care, and electricity. And people cannot survive if those things are cut off. So this was very, very, I think those statements were compelling, very, very strong evidence. In some of the other genocide...
They are strong evidence of?
Genocidal intent.
And how likely is it that the court will say it's a genocide?
The International Court of Justice doesn't have the jurisdiction over all bad things that happen in a place. This is, I think, the 17th genocide case to come before the International Court of Justice. And in all the others, basically the people making the claim have lost.
Wow.
It's been very hard at the court, and particularly in two cases dealing with the Balkans, one filed by Bosnia and the other filed by Croatia. And there were judgments in 2007 and 2015. The court dismissed the charge of genocide against Serbia and adopted a fairly strict interpretation of the Genocide Convention and a very high standard for the proof of the genocidal intent. That's the core of the issue. It looked to me at the time like the Genocide Convention was a dead duck. It wasn't going to be. It wasn't going to be useful because of the narrow interpretation. And so really the question is the court going to become more liberal about the definition of genocide and the proof of genocide? This is an important convention. Make it come alive instead of marginalizing it.
Could you explain to me how you would classify what Hamas is doing?
Well, there were definitely war crimes that were committed on the 7th of October. And the taking of hostages is a war crime. So there's no difficulty with that. The firing of the missiles that Hamas has been doing now for many, many years, and it's very doubtful that the missiles are targeted in a very general sense, in that they're not being targeted at the Mediterranean Sea or at Egypt, but they're being targeted at Israel. And I think that...
At civilians also?
Well, that's the question. You know, again, it's the difficulty in deciding who's being targeted. And one of the defenses that both Israel and Hamas will make is saying, well, you can miss. We targeted, but we missed. Sorry, we hit the civilians. It's difficult with the Hamas weapons because they have been fairly improvised to date. And they haven't hit very much anyway inside Israel. So it's hard to tell what they're actually targeting. So there are a list of crimes there. I don't know about prisoners and how they've been taken, and maybe the abuse of the hostages as well.
That would classify as a war crime.
Yeah, those would be war crimes.
Yeah. You have called what Israel is doing a genocide. At what point was it clear for you?
I was careful about this at the early stages of the conflict. I've always been rather cautious myself. I think people say I'm very conservative about it. Maybe that's true, but I think I was just being realistic about how courts were applying genocide, which was in a very narrow, strict manner. And if you took that and you looked at the conflict in Gaza at the very beginning, you'd say, it wasn't clear to me in the first weeks. There were some people in the first days saying this is genocide. But then as it became clear, I reached I think we have to call it genocide, and I've been saying this for many months. Yeah.
There's also another reflex we could see, like, for example, when pro-Israel supporters argue that Israel is being criticized more harshly due to anti-Semitism after the attack of the 7th of October in 2023. Is there some truth to that?
Well, I generally reject that claim very broadly. I have no doubt that there are some people who criticize Israel who are anti-Semitic. But it doesn't mean that criticism of Israel is driven generally by anti-Semitism. I myself am of Jewish descent. I come from a family of Holocaust survivors, and there are many people like myself who are very critical of Israel.
Yeah. Have you been accused of being anti-Semitic?
We're not anti-Semitic. How could we be anti-Semitic?
Yeah.
We don't like what that government's doing and the way they're treating, because we respect the dignity and the lives of the Palestinians. And we don't want to be part of an enterprise that's done in our name as a people of Jewish descent against other people.
Western leaders, such as the Netherlands, have continued to support Israel during this war. What kind of consequences could that have legally? Legally,
they could find themselves before the International Court of Justice. I wrote an opinion that was used in a court case in the United States that focused not on whether or not genocide had been committed, but on whether there was a duty to prevent genocide on other countries. In this case, it was the United States, but it would apply to many countries, because the convention is called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, and that has been interpreted by the International Court of Justice to be a robust obligation on states with influence, states that can influence.
Such as the US.
Such as the United States.
Yeah.
So, Tonga in the Pacific Ocean doesn't really have a heavy obligation to influence Israel. But countries that support it politically, that provide it with material, diplomatic, economic support, they do. That's the position of the International Court of Justice. And that obligation comes alive when there is a serious risk of genocide.
So it's other countries have a duty to prevent a genocide being committed.
Correct.
And which countries, you mentioned the US?
Yes.
How about the Netherlands?
Yes, the Netherlands, of course. The Netherlands. I wouldn't put...
What did the Netherlands and the US do?
Well, the US has provided, I think, most of the weapons that have, most of the people who died from explosives and bombs in Gaza were destroyed with things that were made in the United States. I don't want to sound offensive about the Netherlands, but it's not on the same level as the United States in terms of support. But countries like the Netherlands, Canada, where I originally come from, Germany, certainly, have been providing diplomatic support, financial support in different ways. I can't give you the details of the support from the Netherlands, but I think it's there, and there have been court cases in the Netherlands as well trying to prevent that. The obligation is vague in a way. They are to use their influence
to prevent it.
To prevent it. The assumption is...
Which they didn't do.
They have influence, and they're to use it. So that would mean to cease providing material support, clearly cease providing weaponry, but other forms of support, to cease providing diplomatic support, political support, economic support. And basically conveying a message to Israel, which many Western countries have not been doing, is you have crossed a line and gone way too far in your response to the 7th of October. And this is not acceptable, and you have to stop. And probably a lot fewer Palestinians would be dead if they had taken that obligation seriously.
Do you think it is important that, because there's a lot of debate about whether journalists like me should say it's a genocide. Do you think that's important, or what is your advice?
Well, I think journalists should describe what's happening, and that I think the best thing for journalists is to go and ask experts like me.
But you say it's a genocide.
Yeah.
So should I say there's a genocide happening in Gaza?
You should say, I spoke to the learned professor from the university, and he says it's genocide.
Yeah.
And I spoke to the rapporteur, and she says it's genocide. Yeah. I think that's really, that's reporting.
If you look, for example, at the US, where they said they labeled what is happening in Sudan, they said it's a genocide. Also Russia, what they're doing in Ukraine, but they don't do it for Gaza. What does that indicate?
It indicates that the United States has double standards completely, and that they're incapable, the United States, and that they see it in a very cynical way, as that this is a term to be used against people they don't like, and not to be used against the people they like.
And we see more Western leaders doing this, right?
It's politics. Yeah. I mean, this is why when we get into the legal environment, it's harder to be a hypocrite in a legal environment. Well, it's terrible. We're living in a situation where the law is not properly enforced and not enforced universally. And we're moving in that direction, and we have been for centuries in a way. We're moving more and more in that direction, but there's pushing and resistance along the way. You know, you have to have a long-term approach to this stuff. This is something that has changed. It's changed dramatically in my lifetime. I remember as a boy, I remember when Nelson Mandela went to jail. I remember when he came out of jail 30 years later. And of course, I've watched the end of apartheid. It looked pretty desperate in the 1960s.
Is there another parallel we can draw from South Africa? Because Nelson Mandela and others were put in jail for 30 years. They were called terrorists, I think, before.
Indeed.
What can we learn from this case?
I think what we're seeing with Israel is that gradually everything is tightening up around Israel, the way it did in South Africa. So most of the world condemned South Africa in the 1960s. But there were some Western countries that were still friendly and loyal to South Africa, including the Netherlands. Netherlands, European states who were basically protecting South Africa, racist apartheid South Africa, at the United Nations when all the countries of the South were resisting. And then slowly it started to change. I don't know the exact date that the Netherlands changed, but they weren't the last country to abandon South Africa. You know, the last countries to abandon South Africa were the United Kingdom, the United States, and Israel, which had been the biggest friend of South Africa for 20 years.
During the apartheid?
During apartheid. I've seen that in my lifetime. I'm an old man now. I've watched this happen. And I think this will happen too. You know, it's the famous quotation from Martin Luther King about how the moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends towards justice. We will see that, and we are seeing it now.
NTR. Speciaal voor iedereen.